Good morning, everyone. Good morning, all friends, colleagues, seniors, and doctors from all over India and maybe from abroad as well who have logged in today for this webinar. This is the second in the series from the Pulmonix, which you all know is a group of chest physicians who are bringing this to you. Today, we have eminent faculty, eminent guests to honor this particular webinar, which is based on the controversies in the biomarkers of COVID management at home and in the hospitalized patients. I'm sure there will be many unanswered questions which will be solved today under the guidance of our main chief guest and panelist, Professor Dr. Randeep Guleria. As we all know, he is a Padma awardee and he's credited with the establishment of the India's first center for pulmonary medicine and sleep disorder at AIMS. And he is all over in the media as well as his particular talks and lectures, which are guiding us all throughout. So he's the present director of AIMS, as we all know, and we are really, really obliged that he has found time for this humble webinar of ours. So I welcome on behalf of all the panelists here, Dr. Randeep Guleria, sir. And our second panelist as a guest is Dr. Khushrao Bajan. He's a well-known name again in all over India, as well as a fantastic critical care and intensivist presently at the Hinduja Hospital. He's also a part of the Maharashtra Task Force. Very humble, very down to earth. We had a great discussion even just before our program started. And we have other colleagues. My co-moderator, my very dear colleague, Dr. Kumar Doshi, who heads the pulmonary medicine at Asian Institute of Oncology and managing COVID patients at Ghatkopar Shatabdi Hospital and other hospitals as well. We have with us Dr. Samir Garde, who is the head of pulmonology at Global Hospital Parel and managing COVID patients at Shushrusha Hospital at Dadar. And we have with us Dr. Kinjal Modi, who has been a leading eminent pulmonologist from Khar Hinduja Hospital. And having scores of patients he's been managing since the pandemic, even at home and in the hospitals in the western suburbs. So that's just to give an overview of what this team is about and what our webinar is all about. I would first, without wasting more time, because we have sir with us till 10:30. So I'm already telling you that sir is going to leave us by 10:30. But I would request Dr. Randeep Guleria, sir, to please give his opening remarks, especially for today's burning topic about the controversies in the biomarkers in COVID-19 in the second wave. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bendre, and thank you for to the entire team of Pulmonix for inviting me over. I think the topic that you've chosen is very, very important, and as it's as important as the topic that you did last week, and that was basically the use of radiology. There are a lot of radiologists who are in a panic mode with the number of CT scans that are being done and the radiation exposure that is happening. In a similar manner, there are a lot of labs which have actually have run out of their capacity to do testing and have given huge waiting lists for testing because of the fact that the panic which has set in has led to a large number of people on their own getting tests done or physicians prescribing tests which have very little significance unless you look at them in the clinical context. And that's what creates a huge panic because we know that many of these biomarkers, and we have biomarkers which could be looking at various factors. It could be inflammatory biomarkers, we'd be looking at the hematological part, it could be looking at others as far as the cytokine storm is concerned. Many of them are non-specific. They will rise in any inflammatory response. That is the body's own inflammatory response. So you will have biomarkers which will rise even if you had a cold, cough, or a mild infection. And therefore, just to say that a rise in a biomarker is enough to start you or escalate your treatment in the form of steroids, in the form of anticoagulants, or in the form of other medication, including drugs like remdesivir, is actually not correct. And I think that is what is very important to understand. What are biomarkers? Yes, there are studies which show that biomarkers can be useful in predicting severity. Various severity scores have been developed. Looking at biomarkers, people have even looked at the NL ratio and other things. But the important thing to understand is that even if you looked at these biomarkers in your hospital in other patients, many of them will have a high biomarker. Many years ago, almost 20 years ago, we did a study for COPD and we looked at acute exacerbation of COPD and CRP levels. and to see what happened to them in patients who were in hospital and those who actually went on to a ventilator. At that point in time, there was not that much of a use of non-invasive ventilation that came later on. So most patients who were having severe COPD would get intubated and we put on a ventilator. What we found was that in all of them, on day one, CRP level was very high and it would come down subsequently. And it was a good predictor if you looked at the change in CRP over a period in time rather than looking at it at a given point in time. And that is also important for biomarkers. You may have some biomarkers which may rise and come down, and then you need not worry. Yes, you may have some biomarkers which may show a rising trend, and that may be a red flag for what you need to do and how closely you need to monitor the patient. But I would just like to say the treatment strategy cannot be guided by biomarkers alone. And that is the most important thing for us to really remember. And that I think is the key point that I would like to put forward. Because what is happening right now is that not only physicians, but patients on their own, looking at their CRP value, looking at their IL-6 value, or looking at things like their D-dimer, are starting treatment on their own. That my D-dimer is high, I will develop a clotting mechanism, I will develop clots. So they will start on their own taking an injection at home or start drugs like antiplatelet drugs, for which there is no logic. Similarly, I have patients who will tell me that, look, my IL-6 is slightly on the higher side. Should I start tocilizumab? I tell him that IL-6, there is enough data to tell you that IL-6 will be high even in any inflammation. As a matter of fact, I remember reading a study many months ago which compared IL-6 levels in COVID positive patients and non-COVID positive patients in an ICU. And the IL-6 levels were higher in the non-COVID patients in the ICU as compared to the COVID patient. So again, it is not a marker to start tocilizumab. We don't start tocilizumab in all our patients who are non-COVID and who have high IL-6 levels. It's again a marker which tells us that there is an inflammatory response, and very often we look at the clinical picture and start treatment. Therefore, I would just give this opening remark that please be holistic. We look at the whole picture. Don't just look at markers and don't have a knee-jerk reaction just because of the markers. And I would actually go one step ahead and say that in mild cases, there is no need to do testing for biomarkers. Exactly. Forget getting lab tests done. You have your clinical criteria, follow them up. It's only when you have some red flags clinically that you should get biomarkers, not the other way around. This is just what I would like to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I think this is fantastically put, and it makes actually our job much easier, because coming from you and it going towards all these doctors who are treating COVID patients, I think it's a very, very important lesson which Dr. Guleria sir just now gave on D-dimers and biomarkers in COVID and non-COVID. We'll have a more of a discussion on that. So I would request Dr. Kushrao to please give his remarks and then hand over the mic. You can, Dr. Kumar, you can take over once Dr. Kushrao finishes opening remarks. Yeah.
So I'm extremely privileged again to be invited at the Pulmonx, and Dr. Guleria actually gave us all the tips and tricks that we might be discussing in the next 1 hour. So thank you, sir. I am a little bit of a biggest pessimist here. And what we have realized in the last 1 year of our COVID scenario, the fighting the pandemic, we've realized not therapies that work, but we've realized what does not work much more than anything else. Biomarkers are extremely controversial in this, and in my experience as an intensivist, I'm the odd one out. I'm the only one who's not a chest physician, I guess, in this audience. But in my experience over 2.5 decades, I have realized that I have never really looked at biomarkers before the COVID era. For me, a D-dimer was always a negative predictive, and now it's become a positive predictive. The CRP, in my own words, was a glorified ESR. The PCT, I was never using to diagnose bacterial infection, but I would use it to stop my antibiotics. And always, as Dr. Guleria said, the trend is important. It's not a one-time figure. Interleukins, I'm glad sir spoke about that. Interleukins, we used to use before the COVID era, and sir and everyone here would agree that it was used only for the moderate therapy of ulinastatin and all those exotic novel therapies. And we used to hunt for an interleukin 6 report, which was hardly available in 1% of the ICUs. And now a 6 by 6 foot lab gives an IL-6 report in 4 hours. So that itself says that I think we've been swept off our feet with the biomarkers, and it's very good that you all have taken this very important issue. And before I take more time, we really want to hear what the panel has to say.
Thank you, Dr. Kushraf. Could you just expand on your remarks regarding how often really do you see this thrombotic complications in your practice, which is largely critical care practice?
Yeah, in COVID, you mean, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So COVID and thrombosis is the only thing which has shown a very consistent picture. There are very good articles which say that it can range from 5 to 50%. And there is the latest multi-analysis which says 32% of COVID patients would have an incidence of thrombosis. Almost 15% of them have pulmonary embolism, which could be life-threatening. There could be strokes and coronary artery disease, but even arterial thrombi, mesenteric thrombi, retinal artery thrombi are also known. So we know that there is 1/3 to 1/5 of the patients that are admitted with severe COVID do have thrombosis. Now, why is this thrombosis so common in COVID as against any other illness, including sepsis? So in COVID, we have a separate etiology called as COVID-associated coagulopathy. Now, this is a mixture of all that has happened in the last few decades. So it's not only DIC where the platelets only drop and the PT-INR goes up, but it is a thrombotic SIC, which is a sepsis-induced thrombosis. Plus, on top of that, there is inflammation, cytokines, cascades of coagulation being activated. There is endothelial damage, and there is, to top it all, microthrombi. So I think thrombosis is a very, very big killer in COVID.
So now, carrying it forward from this, Dr. Guleria, this is what has set off the panic button. Now, all this information which Dr. Kushraf is putting forth is in COVID times available in the public. Thrombosis is something which even my daughter tells me that what is thrombosis. So it has become a home word kind of this thing. Now, in this scenario where the thrombotic complications are so often talked about, people don't understand that these are limited to severe COVID patients. And hence this whole panic of the elevated D-dimer values and people then instituting oral anticoagulation, parenteral anticoagulation at home. What would be your views, Dr. Guleria, of this rapid use of D-dimers and use of anticoagulations in mild COVID, especially the home-treated COVID? And at what point, if you could guide the physicians over here, there are huge number of general practitioners also listening to us, where along with patients, even they are bombarded and they are also equally panicked seeing a value of 700 or 800, and they would immediately, there would be a reaction that he has to get admitted for anticoagulation. There is no bed, so we started at home. What would be your views on this, sir?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very, very important question. And the important thing to remember is that all the data that we've looked at, as far as the thrombotic events are concerned, and they are significant. We've had patients who have died because of that, are only in those who have moderate to severe illness. Actually, matter of fact, bulk of these are basically ICU-based data. And these are patients who have severe illness. So whenever we're looking at it, we must look at what is the data coming from, or where is the data coming from? What is your denominator? The denominator here is patients admitted with severe infection. It's not all patients with COVID. If we were to say that, or if we were to look at it from the other point of view, how many patients who have mild illness have actually gone on to a thromboembolic event? That data is very low. That is not very high. And therefore, if you were to do a risk-benefit analysis, probably the risk of giving a lot of high-dose anticoagulants to those with mild illness is higher than whatever benefit you get by starting it on day one. Therefore, I would say that even if you have your values of D-dimer on the higher side, remember D-dimer can be high in a number of conditions. Important thing to remember is D-dimer is always used as a negative predictive value when you are looking at pulmonary thromboembolism. You looked at that as a screening test. If your D-dimer was low, you would say the chance of pulmonary thromboembolism is less. A high D-dimer can occur in a large number of inflammatory things. So it's not that D-dimer shows that it's a hypercoagulable state and you need to start anticoagulants. That is one thing to remember. And the second important thing to remember is that the data that we are having in terms of thrombotic events is predominantly from severe patients, admitted patients, is not from outdoor patients. So therefore, those patients who have mild illness, who are in a home setting, even if the D-dimer is mildly elevated, you should not go into a panic situation and say that this is need for starting anticoagulants. I've seen prescriptions where patients have been started on Ecosprin. That also is of no use. There is no data to suggest that you should start. And now even for mild COVID, if you look at prescriptions, Ecosprin is given routinely. There is no data that there is actually use antiplatelet drugs have any use. So the issue is that I think we are having a panic reaction, maybe driven by patients, but also driven by physicians who really don't know where or how this virus is going to behave. And therefore, it's very important for us to really say that not only treatment, the timing of treatment is very important. And this is true for all drugs that we use for COVID, whether it be remdesivir, whether it be steroids, whether it be tocilizumab. If you give them early and you give them when it's not required, it will cause more harm than good. The recovery trial classically showed that if steroids were given early, there was higher mortality. If steroids were given only when you had fall in oxygen saturation, was it of benefit? Similarly, the same thing applies for anticoagulants. So I would really urge that you don't need to give any anticoagulants at home. And I know many doctors who prescribe patients a subcutaneous injection at home of Plexig, which doesn't make sense at all. And there are people who are taking it, they have bruises on their abdomen because of the fact that they're taking this injection, which is not required. So please look at the data and please look at it from where it is coming from. It's coming from sick patients who are admitted, and there are no patients who, none of it, this data is from an outpatient setting or from mild illness. So you don't need to give it in patients who have mild illness. I would say you don't even need to get the D-dimer done in such a situation.
Most important message. When you have a mild patient, so clinical medicine comes first, mild patient, don't do dimers. And if you have done it, please don't get panic. And most importantly, the thrombosis in COVID is not platelet driven. So antiplatelet drugs like Ecosprin are not going to be of any use. Dr. Khusro, now going beyond D-dimers, the second test which is creating panic reactions amongst patients is the CRP. Like as you yourself put it, like CRP was nothing more than glorified ESR, and it's going to be elevated in a host of conditions. And the third is the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. It has its own place. But could you just guide the people who are listening to us as when are you going to give these two investigations important, especially when they are just diagnosed a mild case, and how do they go forward with that?
Yeah, so I completely again agree with Dr. Guleria. All these biomarkers, including D-dimer, CRP, should never be done at home in a mild case. Only and only when they come to a hospital, maybe we want to look at it. What people are doing is this entire biomarker gamut, including the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, the CRPs, the ferritins, the interleukins, and everything else is being done as a package. And this is done almost every alternate day or even sometimes every day. And whenever it rises, obviously the disease is going to progress a little. So it rises by even say 50%, panic button starts and they say you need hospitalization, you need all the therapy cocktail of low molecular weight, steroids, etc. So I personally feel instead of dissecting out each one of these biomarkers, they are all probably the same, which indicate D-dimer indicates thrombosis and inflammation, and the CRP and the interleukins and all the others indicate inflammation and severity of disease. CRP, having said that, in our first year, we did not know the disease very well, and therefore we did look at CRP in the ICU settings. And there, if the CRP was more than 75 or 100, that would probably indicate that the patient is quite critical. If clinically also he or she was bad. As regards the NLR ratio, it's a common ratio which we follow even in the non-COVID. So whenever you have a ratio of more than 3.5, where the lymphopenia sets down, we know that it's a viral disease. We know that it's a severe viral disease. So any NLR more than 3.5 is indicative. But we also can look at the CBC a little more in detail and look at the PLR and also the lymphocyte to monocyte ratio. And if the lymphocyte monocyte ratio is less than 10, that is indicative of severity again. So we have less of lymphocytes and more of monocytes, and that's a reasonably recovering style. So I think we can look at markers, but remember, this is only a tool, and our clinical judgment is pivotal.
Dr. Kushro, will the NLR ratio still be as relevant in absence of leukopenia?
Yeah, so if the person is already having leukopenia as a disease, then it does not mean much, but NLR ratio definitely matters when there is lymphopenia. So it's the ratio that is important and not just the figure.
Yes.
Correct. So I think what points we have got through is about the NLR and even the ratio of lymphocyte monocyte. We have to have it with a clinical correlation. That is the most important message that we need to send it across. We are not going to see only the reports, only the CRPs. We need to have the patient in perspective, because if there is COVID, there could be other diseases also. I mean, we have seen patients with a urinary infection and COVID. We have seen patients with a renal calculi and COVID. There are patients with seborrheic dermatitis and COVID. There are patients with diabetes with superadded infections and COVID. So when we say the inflammatory markers are raised, even in a COVID patient, let's be on one common ground that there has to be a clinical correlation with this patient. Sir, before you, if you are there with us, I will be very obliged if you are there all throughout. But I would like your views on this ferritin and LDH, because these are two values somehow. Again, they have been like, there are packages. I don't know about Delhi, but in Mumbai, at least there are packages that the pathologists and the labs are giving. COVID positive package of XYZ test. Day 3 package of XYZ test. So please tell us a little more about ferritin and LDH in terms of COVID.
So again, all of these are biomarkers which are used for various utility, and people say that you could look at LDH for looking at cellular inflammation or cell damage. But as we've said, these are very, very non-specific. And if you look at the data very critically, none of these have been actually shown to have a great significance in overall treatment strategy. Yes, there are some data which have looked at this as prognostic markers and said that if these values are very high, this suggests that these patients may be going into a severe illness. Again, like I said in the past, whether we look at D-dimer, ferritin, LDH, all of these have been looked in patients who have severe illness and have been therefore used as a criteria whether they need to be in the ward or whether they may be shifted to an ICU or whether they need more closer monitoring. So some ICUs use these values, and various equations or severity scores have been made just to try and see that can we be able to segregate patients in a manner that those who need to be in the ICU as compared to those who need to be in the ward. But it doesn't really point towards a utility for treatment strategy. Your treatment strategy, whether it be steroids or other anti-inflammatory drugs, tocilizumab, is more dependent on other parameters which has to be holistic. Therefore, ferritin, CRP, LDH, or IL-6 levels have limited utility when you look at them alone. And unfortunately, because of the fact that there is a panic, these packages have been offered. These packages are done by some patients every alternate day. And they will do it so frequently that you wonder why is it being done so frequently, and they are totally asymptomatic. And then because of that, you start getting a pressure that now should we start steroids? Should I buy tocilizumab? Should I keep it at home because maybe the IL-6 will go up further? So I think it's very important to really be able to, for physicians to understand this and to be able to explain this to these patients that these are markers which will be elevated otherwise also. Many of these are elevated when we talk of serum ferritin, and people take cutoffs, serum ferritin more than 500, CRP more than 10 times, IL-6 more than 5 times, LDH more than 250. All of these markers are just used by people as sort of criteria to start drugs. I don't think there is enough evidence to say that by using these markers, you can start any medication. I would just like to say these are just to guide physicians not to really dictate how things are to be done. That I think is the important thing.
Yes, sir. Very, very right. I think that's why the recent AIMS guidelines have actually not emphasized on LDH and ferritin. I think
Yes, we don't think it's that important really to go by.
yeah. So, and also, sir, I will just go ahead and say that not only, Kushro, Dr. Kushro, please.
Sorry. As absolutely rightly said, all these are just markers. One word about ferritin. If sometimes the ferritin, if done, is about 300-400, and then suddenly the patient is getting worse, and he develops lymphopenia and something more, or pancytopenia, and the ferritin levels are 2000 or 10,000, then we might want to think of the macrophage activation syndrome or the HLH, because that can happen with dengue. We know it can happen with typhoid, and we have some reports along with even COVID. So ferritin, I do not believe in, I don't do it. But if the person is getting worse and you do not realize that what is the cause of the deterioration after an initial improvement, then keep HLH in mind.
Very, very, very perfectly put. I think all our people who are listening, one is that for hospitalization or for just for home treatment, let's not give this as unnecessary importance to these values. And sir, I will also go one step ahead, sir, Guleria sir and Dr. Khusrav, that even discharges are planned based on these tests. Means the patient has improved, symptomatically better, but just because the levels are high, CRP is high, or maybe even for that matter, ferritin is high, the patients are told that you need to wait and observe for a couple of days. We repeat it after 2 days, then the discharge. And that is one big reason why the hospital bed availability is at stake today. So
if I may just add before I go, I totally agree with this. You see, you have to look at the patient's clinical profile. But some inflammatory markers will take their time to come down. You can't wait for them to really come down. And they will guide, you cannot guide your discharge by looking at inflammatory markers. Similarly, you cannot really look at your treatment strategy subsequently based on inflammatory markers. There's no data to suggest that also. So again, inflammatory markers have to be looked at in the context of the patient, in the context of the clinical picture, rather than just being driven by the inflammatory markers, because like you said, there are so many other conditions which may be non-COVID related, which may be driving the inflammation. The patient may have a lot of other things which are causing systemic inflammation, and the markers may take a longer time to come down. We don't really need to, therefore, worry too much about that.
Thank you, sir.
I can just say what he said was good old clinical medicine, common sense would help us to admit, treat, and discharge the patients in much more effective way than what it is today.
Totally. I agree with that.
Salil, before Dr. Guleria leaves the meeting, I just wanted to compliment him. Sir, your image of taking the first shot of vaccine has gone into the pages of history, not only with common people, but also with doctors like us who follow you very closely. And that has been a great source of inspiration for us to force our patient to go ahead and take vaccine. We have already finished taking our vaccines, but you have been constant source of inspiration for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. But my source of inspiration is all my fellow colleagues who are there and fighting this battle together. So it's my turn to thank you all for all that you've done. Each one of us has done his bit. Thank you very much for being part of
Thank you
so much, sir, for your presence. Thank you so much. And we will involve you again whenever we need you again.
It will be my pleasure. I'm sorry I have to leave, but it'll be my pleasure to come back again.
No,
thank you.
In a short time, you have given us a concise information what we needed for all patients. Sir. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we will move ahead, Dr. Samir, as just the comment which Dr. Guleria sir made, about discharges being planned and admissions being planned. One kid on the block, I can say, when COVID came into play all over since last March, is IL-6, interleukin 6. And I think, I'm sure that you have gone to rounds in the COVID ICU or COVID wards. And the first thing the patient utters is, सर मेरा IL-6 तो 80 है, अभी मुझे ऑक्सीजन चाहिए, मुझे रेमडेसिविर कैसा मिल नहीं रहा है, क्या करने का. So I would like you to tell us a little bit of non-COVID causes of IL-6, because that is somehow now taken a back seat. So we would like your words on that, please.
So Salil, all of us here, we are clinicians, and as Dr. Guleria and Dr. Khusrav had been telling, that we all are clinicians first, and we have been taking our decisions clinically. In fact, even in the first wave in the last year, whenever I question my colleagues who were eager to give somebody tocilizumab or something else based on IL-6. I was a big villain because I was asking them questions which they did not have an answer for. But I think 1 year down the line, we know that IL-6 is, as Dr. Kushra has beautifully explained, that it goes up in so many illnesses like, first of all sorts of autoimmune disorders, RA, lupus, any damn infection, any reason of sepsis, some cancers, simply somebody who is a diabetic, Alzheimer's, schizophrenic. There are so many reasons where IL-6 goes up. Keep aside all the illnesses. Salil, when a blood is collected, how Dr. Kushra said, a 6 foot by 6 foot lab is just doing IL-6 every day. The way you collect the sample, whether you have taken it in the ETTA bulb, whether you have taken it in a plain bulb, how much you have kept it, where you have preserved it, just keeping the sample in a plain tube for at 37 degrees somewhere, the IL-6 goes up by 9 times than its normal value. So there are so many things happening here. So we obviously cannot pinpoint on IL-6 in even in severe COVID cases. Somebody, and see, all the severe cases of COVID happen in people with comorbidity, say diabetes, say obese people, say some background illnesses. So obviously their IL-6, who has checked their IL-6 even any time before? Nobody has checked. So we do not know their baseline IL-6 to begin with. And to what we are comparing? We are comparing it to a normal range. But suppose somebody's IL-6 was originally deranged because he was a diabetic. Secondly, another important aspect here is that there is always a crosstalk, and this has been understood very recently, maybe in a decade's time, that there is a crosstalk between hemostasis and inflammation. What we talked initially about coagulation, and so why I'm taking this here is because we are talking about inflammatory markers. The factor 7A or factor 10A or thrombin in a collected blood can increase the IL-6. So there is. So these people who are having inflammation in their body in COVID patients, and you have collected their blood, the factors within the blood itself can react and give rise to falsely high IL-6 levels. So again, the bottom line is very, very clear that all our decisions have to be primarily clinically based and do not look at any inflammatory markers only in one point of time. A trend is very, very important.
So I think that's it's very significant that we interpret this value, because there are, as Dr. Samir has told us, there are many non-COVID causes. And unfortunately, I should say, it's a WhatsApp university, it's a Google Doc, it's so many rumors which are spreading, and people are getting half educated. And even the smaller things but important things about the collection of blood, how much time it has taken, how it has been preserved. If these are the issues which can alter an IL-6, we can imagine how much it will be actually percolated in terms of the therapy in these diseases. So I would like anyone and everyone to please take your, if you have got any input.
Salil, if the blood is not collected properly, IL-6 values can be triple figure in all the patients. We have seen 300 values of 300 and 400 ultra stable patients. But Kushra, as far as you are concerned, purely in critical care medicine, how often is your decision of tocilizumab only IL-6 driven, or it is just a validating factor? This too is elevated. It is driven the decision of TOSI in your ICU?
I'm very glad, Kumar, you asked this question. First and foremost, I would just want to take a minute on talking about Tosili. Now, Tosili has been used extensively till, say, October, November. But after that, there was enough theory and data to say that Tosili does not help. And also using Tosili along with steroids increases the bacterial and fungal infection, including mucor, which you all must be seeing very often, by twice or threefold. And therefore, Tosili went out of the market. But just the latest guidelines of 21st April, as recent as 4 days ago, in the ITSA and in the NIH state that tocilizumab can be used at the same dose of 800 milligrams or 8 milligrams per kg in patients which are admitted within 3 days and those who show within 24 hours a respiratory worsening in terms of need for NIV, need for HFNC, need for intubation, and worsening PF ratios within 24 hours. That is the time to use it. There is a grade B3A evidence for where they have mentioned also looking at the CRP of more than 75 or an interleukin more than 5 times normal, the 7 being the cutoff, so anything more than 35. So that is an asterisk, but I don't think anybody should follow the CRP and the interleukins without respiratory compromise to rule out CRS.
Khushro, just for the benefit of all, could you elaborate exactly what a PF ratio means? And it means basically we need to know, everybody needs to know what is the PF ratio, and also they need to know what is grade 3B, what is the strength of that evidence such that it percolates down the line.
Okay, so but yes, we very commonly use short terms like PF ratio or PaO2 FiO2 ratio. It is nothing but a PaO2 FiO2 ratio. So my oxygen in the body, if I'm a non-smoker, which I am, would be 100 and in good times, and my FiO2 is 0.2, which is the FiO2 I take oxygen from the air, and therefore my PF ratio normally should be around 450 to 500. Having said that, whenever we need more and more oxygen to try and improve the oxygen saturations or the PaO2 of the body, we are worsening this ratio. So we have a term, the Berlin definition, which now even includes the PEEP, thankfully, says that there is mild, moderate and severe ARDS, and the acute lung injury is taken off. And therefore, they say that any PF ratio or PaO2 FiO2 ratio less than 200, less than 150, less than 100 with plus 5 PEEP. So that itself indicates the severity of ARDS, the severity of lung damage. So I think that should explain that PF ratio is extremely important to follow more than any of the biomarkers.
So the PF ratio includes measuring blood gases and not saturations.
Yes,
You have to
yes.
understand that rather than IL-6, getting a blood gas in the ICU patient, measure the PF ratio, and then IL-6 comes down the stream. And a small word on what is grade 3B. How strong is that evidence?
Yeah, so basically we have grades of level from A to D, and we have grades from 1 to 4 or 5. And basically 3B basically means that it does not do major harm, but it can be used and it is useful. Yeah.
So it is not a panacea.
No, and it cannot be recommended. You have to consider it.
Consider it. So this is the clarity of thought on TOSI in ICU. Samir, you had a word to add to that?
One sub question to Dr. Khushro again on this, because there is a shortage of tocilizumab. People are trying things like bevacizumab, and people are literally circulating this on the WhatsApp that, oh, now this is not available. This is the new kid on the. Please a word on that, Dr. Khushro.
Yeah, so there is an article which says that bevacizumab, I can't even pronounce it. How will I use it then if I don't know how to pronounce it? Yeah, so there is a study which it can be used along with steroids though. All the Tosili was not mentioning much of steroids. So here there is a mention that this can be used along with steroids, and we still need more data. So there are lots of things like interferons and monoclonal antibodies and whatnot in the treatment, but I don't think we have enough data to start using it.
And the data is so small coming out from Bangladesh, and it was comparing it with tocilizumab. And it showed when compared with tocilizumab, there was about 20% reduction in mortality. So you're looking at extremely sick patients.
Yeah.
So it would be too small a data to people. Yesterday, they sent me a WhatsApp. Is this bevacizumab a substitute?
Yeah. Correct.
So that's not the way to go. That answers your questions, Samir. Important one, that T or B, no marbs are panaceas. Okay.
And also people think that if the patient has a respiratory failure and is worsening, giving tocilizumab might or any of the MABs might actually prevent ventilation. Yes. So please, everyone should take one message home that Tosili is not a substitute for ventilation. Good ICU practice, early intubation is the key to get reduced mortality.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, Dr. Kumar, first is just adjust your volume. Your voice is a little, the volume seems to be lesser. That is one. And I'm not going to the question answer, but before I invite Kinjal for a particular comment, I am seeing one very important remark which has been put up in the chat box which I have by Dr. Ajay Lanzewar from Nagpur. Okay, this is important at this point of time. We know the situation is very grim at many places. Okay, we know about Nasik, but as well as Nagpur. So he's put a remark that in a situation where there are no bed available, how do we manage, if at all, at home? And are you suggesting that let the people die by not doing biomarkers? So our discussion today is not at all related to that you should never do biomarkers. If the patient is critical, and as we are all discussing, it's moderate or severe hypoxic, they need to be hospitalized. There is no question. We cannot be able to be treated at home because clinically worsening, deterioration, hypoxia, desaturation, that person needs to be hospitalized, and biomarkers are expectedly going to be abnormal. So it's not the message that never do biomarkers. We are talking for mild cases, and we are talking at specific scenarios that don't decide admissions if the patient is clinically stable but the biomarkers are abnormal. Don't decide discharges if the patient is better but the biomarkers are raised. And let's not start patients on unnecessary medications or home ecosprin. So let's get that message across, because it's a very important comment which has come from a very dear colleague of mine, Dr. Ajay Lanjewar from Nagpur.
No,
Anyone
basically,
wants to add to that?
we are not
Thanks,
suggesting
Khalil, for
people
clearing
die.
this.
It's that we are limiting our discussion to overuse of biomarkers in mild cases. If there are moderate or severe clinically, it stands to reason that you have to do all the necessary investigations.
Absolutely.
There is no such suggestions that we need to allow patients to suffer.
So Dr. Kinjal, now that we are at this point of discussion, I would like, since you are doing excellent work in home management of cases, and it's a tricky area. I'll tell you, if the patient is in the hospital, patient is in the ICU, we are at ease, the relatives are at ease, because we know we can do many things in the hospital. We can give them medications, oxygen. But to manage a patient in the house and to decide about the clinical parameters and the biomarkers in mild cases, how do you go about it? And can you elaborate a little bit more about, sometimes patient is normal but IL-6 are high, so there will be a panic button even in home treatment. So please tell us about the home management of mild cases in vis-a-vis the biomarkers of COVID.
And the challenges which you face because
The
of all this.
challenges, yes, that will help us also understand. Yes, please.
Sure, sir. Thank you, Salil sir and Dr. Kumar, for putting this question across to me. Am I audible properly, sir?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, and also, I'm also very grateful to a co-panelist, especially Dr. Randeep Guleria sir and Khushru sir, basically for setting up the ball rolling for putting up the biomarkers, where to use, where not to use. But till now, what we're discussing was, it means that it was clear message that IL-6 and other biomarkers to be used in critical ill patients, moderate to severe patients, ICU patients, perfectly okay. We don't have any issues regarding that. But what patient we see at home, they are graduates and postgraduates from WhatsApp University, Media Mahavidyalaya, and friends and relations, colleagues, colleges. So that is what we are facing. So, and as Dr. Guleria sir and Dr. Khushru already told, that we have packages of COVID positive patients coming from labs. Day 1 test, day 2 test, day 3 test, everything done before patient comes to us. So that is the unfortunate part, but that is the truth. First question that comes to our mind is, are those tests needed? That is the first question comes to our mind. Before classifying that basically are they needed or not, we should always go back to the basics of the discussion of this today's topic is, we are discussing mild, moderate, severe cases, how they are differentiated. We have to go back and just go through the task force classification which is given by Maharashtra Task Force. Very nice classification, A, B, C, D, E. Where your patient falls, please go and check that first. I am definitely sure people who are apart from chest physicians have not even seen that guidelines. Please see the efforts which is put on by the task force. Dr. Kushal is a part of it. There are very good chest physicians and other physicians in that group who have put up a very nice guidelines. Mild cases, moderate cases, severe cases. First differentiate that. It is not based on any biomarkers. It is based on clinical findings, vital signs. what we are interacting the patient history and all those things. There is nothing, not a single point of biomarkers in that whole guidelines. Please confirm that first. That is the first point to remember. Next point we'll go ahead is basically that what we are treating mild cases. Just as a point of fact, at some point of time, a week back, I found that there was more than 6 lakhs patient in home isolation in Mumbai itself. So this is the whole purview of home isolation going on, including me, other people who are managing patients at home, face a plenty of problems, starting from the getting a proper history, getting a proper examination, proper vitals being noticed. I have found out people not having used proper SpO2. They don't know how to use thermometer. They are putting a scanner on their head and checking the temperature and sending across to me, even though the temperature is on the higher side. So all the small points, yeah, we can discuss all these things in a later things. But these are the simple things. While home isolation, we have to very perfect to get the details out of patient. Number 1 point. Number 2, we don't have to ask them a blanket investigations. No, you just require basic investigation like a blood counts, liver profile, kidney profile, just to check a basic CRP. At home, your IL-6 is not required. A CRP works as a IL-6. It is basically has been already been told that CRP is almost goes in hand with IL-6. So if the patient is worsening and you have a higher CRP, definitely must be having other biomarkers also on the higher side. So we don't need a IL-6. For the more than thousands of patients I have treated at home, not a single patient I have advised IL-6. But yeah, I do have as been told that basically IL-6 is been come to me with a higher IL-6. Recently, I had a patient perfectly okay on the verge of discharge from my side, but he did a IL-6 and got it. He was very much worried. The lady was very much, sir, my IL-6 is this value.
I think some network issue probably.
Yeah, Kinjal got that lady blocked Kinjal from speaking.
He's caught in the storm. He's caught in the storm when he was talking of IL-6.
So Kushro, I can yeah, there he is.
Also again,
Yes, Kinjal.
thank you.
Please come.
Thanks.
Please
So
come in.
IL-6 basically is a storm. So basically, when the IL-6 when starts speaking of IL-6, everything goes wrong. So the lady was adamant.
Kinjal is having some
Man,
network.
you are fine. Your vitals are okay. Your saturation is okay. It is over. Why are you worried about IL-6? You forget it. IL-6 has number of causes to be on the higher side. Even post-surgical cases, a small pricks here and there, inflammation can cause IL-6, which Dr. Samir has already elaborated in details. So we're not worried about a particular rise in a particular value. No. Trend, as has been already been discussed, trend of CRP, trend of things definitely makes a sense. Yeah, please be careful in elaborating and evaluating every 48 hours you can do, or more than that, depending on your clinical judgment, but not daily. That's what I don't want my patient to get their blood given on daily basis. Is not required here, because any medication we all know it starts after acting after 48 hours. So why the wasting the patient's money and wasting the patient's time, energy for all those things? Other thing, basically, many times we have patient-oriented treatment also. As Dr. Gulera already told, that patient forcing us. Please don't get panic, don't get pressurized in treating this kind of patients. Unfortunately, I get calls from police department also many times. ACP is calling me, sir, ये चीज है, please इनको treatment चालू करना है. Request them, please, आप बहुत ही अच्छे हैं. Please be at home. Don't require hospitalization. Don't go for oxygen therapy. Don't go for low molecular heparin. Negative advice is very much required in today's world, because people are wanting to do everything they want. They
So Dr. Kinjal,
want whatever,
so,
getting
yeah.
a bed, and that is what.
Yeah. So Dr. Kinjal, I think the message which you are putting across is that don't start having those package systems for home isolation. You go clinically. That is, you should of course monitor the patient based on the saturation or a 6-minute walk test. Don't imply or don't give utmost importance to a IL-6 value or a D-dimer, as we have been discussing.
Any marker for that
Yeah.
matter.
Definitely.
But I will add for people who are
Vitals are more important.
yeah, I'll just add one statement for the people who are listening. If you are managing a diabetic patient at home, please monitor the sugars very, very strictly.
Right, sir.
That is something very important you need to do. If you are managing a patient who is on immunosuppressants at home, he's stable, but he's on immunosuppressants for some other illness, please monitor his hemoglobin and the absolute lymphocyte count. So there are certain situations which you will have to modify your home management and decide about what to do and when to do, or when to take the next step. So I think Dr.
Definitely.
Kumar,
So I have, Kushrav, I have two specific scenarios. One is a question put forth by our dear friend, Dr. Roopkatha, who is an intensivist working with me. And second is because we have discussed D-dimers and we have discussed the abuse of anticoagulants, what all kind of complications have you come across because of anticoagulation? That's part A of the question. And part B is, like in an ICU, we see so much of COVID coagulopathy with elevated PT-INRs, and yet they are on anticoagulation. How are you going to manage this quandary?
Yeah, very practical question again, Kumar. So I think Roopkatha was working with us earlier and now with you. So what I would like to say before I answer this is that we need to understand how much anticoagulation do we use in the ICU or in the hospital setting. So there are three dosages for that. One is a prophylactic dose. So I feel any person, now this is no guidelines, but this is 50% of guidance that has been issued by many centers, including the IPSH. So we should use low molecular weight heparin, enoxaparin, 40 milligrams as a prophylactic dose for all patients that are admitted in the hospital with no bleeding risk. That is very important in the asterisk. If they are in ICU and they are moderately sick, then you might go up to an intermediate dose. Now, many of us don't know what an intermediate dose is because it's a new term now. So intermediate dose is 1 milligram per kilogram body weight OD, subcutaneous of enoxaparin again. So if it's an 80 or 90 kg person, something like me, then you might want to give 40 milligrams of enoxaparin twice a day at least. So that is the intermediate dose for the critically ill. And some people are even using therapeutic doses, but that I would reserve only and only for the patients that have proven thrombosis in terms of DVT or pulmonary embolism or even retinal artery, or now we are seeing cases of superior mesenteric artery embolus and thrombus, etc. And that would be same 1 milligram per kilogram subcute, but BID. So this is the armamentarium that we have, and most patients would, if high risk, get intermediate dose, and if they are just hospitalized and moderately sick, they get a prophylactic dose, which anyways all our ICU patients, if you look at the fast hug policy, get a prophylactic dose of enoxaparin or any other low molecular weight imperatively without any ado. Obviously, those patients who have a risk of bleeding, we would not give them. So those who have a GI bleed, those who have any previous allergies or have had a HIT syndrome before, these are the cases where we would not give it. Coming to the bleeding, there are three good studies. One is a magnet study, one is a ADOPT study, and the other is an XCLAIM study, where they have tried extended thromboprophylaxis at discharge, and they have compared enoxaparin with rivaroxaban, enoxaparin with apixaban, and enoxaparin without anything, placebo, and the bleeding risk is at the most 2 times more for without using any low molecular weight. But as against NOACs and enoxaparin was found to have lesser bleeding risk. So there is bleeding risk, but if you take a proper history and rule out, then there is very little bleeding risk seen with anticoagulation.
So Kushrao, just one.
PT-INRs with patients on anticoagulation?
No. So PT-INR is not to be even checked. The low molecular weights that we are using are factor 10A activity, and therefore doing a PT-INR is just part of the DIC that the patient has along with the sepsis-induced coagulopathy.
So don't bother about those values.
I don't see it. Yes, one more point about PT-INR. I would implore everyone to do a SIC scoring system. That is called as a sepsis-induced coagulopathy system, which takes PT-INR, platelets, and the SOFA scoring system of sepsis. And they give 0, 1, and 2 marks for it. So a total of 6. If the SIC is more than 4, there is an increased mortality, there is an increased chance of thrombosis, and therefore this is the group of patients who would benefit more. So if you're looking at PT, I would only look at it with the SIC scoring system.
Yes, Salil, you're saying something?
No. So I was just going to ask to everyone about how many of us have actually seen anticoagulant related side effects. Very less number. I see, at least in my practice, we have seen very less number of patients having anticoagulant related side effects.
We actually just lost a lady at a hospital with a massive lower GI bleed, Malina.
So if we get a long, like in a huge number of patients which you have been seeing,
Very less.
Less. That's true.
Kushru, you come across any anticoagulation associated side effects in the ICU?
So I have not seen much except a little GI bleed, altered blood in the Ryle's tube, and therefore we just stop it for 2 days. But mainly this is because they also have low platelets. So it's not only the PT-INR or the PTT, but it is the low platelets that happen which causes it. So if you have a platelet count already of 80,000 or 50,000, then obviously you would not be using a anticoagulation because that would be a high risk group for bleeding. So if you do a proper selection, then across the board, our orders, even before COVID, was that everyone gets a low molecular weight or thromboprophylaxis in any form, without which ICUs are not doing their part well.
Yeah. So Kushru, let me now put you the more. We have discussed theory and idealistics. सबने व्यासपीठ पे बैठ के भाषण दे दिया. Now let me ask you a very practical question. The CT scan, which has been done, whether we like it or not, whether we have advised or not, and it shows a mild score of 4 to 6. Patient is running fever, which is low grade 9900. Saturations are borderline 94. And we are seeing a lot of mild thrombocytopenia these days, 50,000 to a lakh. Does this patient deserve to be admitted? That's number one, because it is in the gray zone between 1C and 2A. And do they deserve NOACs at home if we don't admit them? Such patients coming to Hinduja casualty, where would he be sent? Home or hospital?
No. So basically, if they have got a scan done, which you all have very nicely discussed last week, and we also have put it up in our guidelines in the task force. So so you are saying a CORAD score or you are saying a severity score?
CORAD score of between 4 and 6.
CORAD is more of a diagnostic tool.
9.
Yeah, so we know CORAD is a diagnostic tool, and anything above 3 would indicate more that it is COVID. But a severity score is different, which is calculated on 25. So if you are saying a patient has
the CTSS, the out of 25.
Okay. Yeah. So he has a very mild CT score, and you said that he's got a saturation of 92?
94. 92.
94.
Because that is
Yeah, so 94 is the cutoff because neither here nor there. I would not send him home, but because the saturations are low, I would first ask whether 5 days before when he or she had contracted the COVID, was it 97, 98 and has it dropped to 94? The trend is important. Secondly, I would also ask whether they have done a walk test, or if the patient is reasonably stable to even go home, I would do a 3-minute walk test in front of me and check if the 94 sats go to 91 or anything. And then definitely I would admit him for observation.
So this is where Dr. Lanjevar's questions comes into picture. Invariably, such patients, when you subject them to even a 3-minute walk test, they desaturate by a couple of points and you don't have a place. So it kind of de facto gets into the moderate variety and you don't have a place. Are NOACs justified as a home therapy in such cases?
There is absolutely no data in giving NOACs to these patients.
What the message has to go across the board.
Absolutely.
So anyone
or Kinjal, you also must be facing such situations practically every day. What would you be doing?
Definitely, sir. Sir, we have got the prescription basically mentioning NOAC by a family physician.
Would you remove it or would you continue it?
I would to struck it off, sir. Always. Please stop. Please stop. Please stop.
Is there anything left after you cancel all these? only Zincovit. Only zinc and vitamin C. If we actually cancel it, I also get these. And if we actually cancel it, the only two which we might allow is a zinc and a vitamin C supplement.
So I think one important question. Kushru, you want to make
Dr. Kinjewal asked a very emotional question, and please don't get us wrong, sir. We are not saying that biomarkers are useless. Yes, we may, even I today might look at the CRP, I might look at the D-dimer. These are the only two, as Kinjal said, I might look at in the pre-hospital setting. The only thing is they are tools and they will only guide you. They may say that, yes, now the patient is looking stable, there is no desaturation, we might have a problem on hand, and do vigorous monitoring, ask them to do a 6-minute walk test twice a day. But I would not throw it off of the dustbin, but neither would I ask for it. All I'm saying is, if it is there, look at it, but look at it in the picture of the clinical context and nothing more.
Manner.
So one very important question I should say from Dr. Suryakant Pandit, because we are talking of home treatment. We should not give any anticoagulation. Patients in the hospital should be given anticoagulation. So Dr. Suryakant wants to know the criteria for anticoagulants in domiciliary and discharged patients. We have already discussed we should not give. So he is asking, then whom should we give in domiciliary and in admitted cases? Should we give for all admitted cases? One, when they are being sent home, should we continue them? And third is at home. Should we never give only, or there are any small window of cases where even at home we need to give them NOACs? So it's open to the floor if anyone would like.
A small part that I can answer basically that whenever patient is in mild to moderate category and we are planning that patient is requiring hospitalization, we know that patient is desaturating, and now we know that patient is going to get a hospital bed in very soon, maybe a day or two. We can start a low molecular heparin or a NOACs at that time when we know that patient deteriorating, and to just buy time so that the patient starts some therapy before going hospital. Post this side, I think Dr. Kushro or someone can answer.
Very difficult. Yeah, please. Samir, after you. Samir or Kumar, you all want to make comments?
Yeah. No, sir. Please go ahead.
Reclassify it from mild to moderate, thereby start till you get a bed.
No, so the previous scenario, what Kumar asked Dr. Kushra about that patient coming to the hospital and a platelet count of 70, 80,000 and 94. Suppose assuming that this patient always was 97% and now coming to the hospital 94%, bed is not available. And you have to put that patient on something till the time bed is available. So is that a right time to give him? So this is similar to what Dr. Suryakant has asked, So I personally feel that if till the time bed gets available and somebody who's got documented desaturation in 5 days from 97 to 94, I think he's proceeding to moderate, and we need to add, say, Novac or teach him how to take Lixin at home. I do not know. I mean, Dr. Kushro will be the right person to guide us on that.
I'm in a tight situation answering this, and we all are, because see, if we can talk two things. One is scientific data and one is our personal opinion. Again, not a task force opinion, just my personal opinion. So basically, there is absolutely no data on starting any of these anticoagulants or NOACs or low molecular weights at home prior to hospitalization. But in a scenario where the platelets are okay, the monitoring is going to be very close, patient is deteriorating rapidly, then there is no harm in giving them low molecular weight. I understand that. I would rather put him on home care doctors who can actually visit and monitor. And there are some systems, I don't know if you all do it, but there are some systems where they go home, they monitor them, and that's almost a ICU or a hospital at home. So in that scenario, definitely we can probably use to save a life. In the hospital, I already mentioned you have mild, moderate and severe cases, not mild, moderate and severe cases, and therefore you would use prophylactic or intermediate. I would almost never use a drip of heparin, though it may have been recommended in proven cases, and I would use subcutaneous heparin in cases of renal failure. About discharge, there is 5 societies, including the ISTH and the NICE guidelines and many others, who have taken votes from people, and they have said that 50% of the people in the ISTH guideline have said that we should not be giving any NOACs to follow-up after discharge. But 50% said that only those who are high risk for thrombosis. Now, this high risk does not mean the clinical severity during the hospitalization, but it means the smokers, the malignant people, etc. Malignant people, the people with malignancies. Otherwise, you might look at me for that. People with malignancies, autoimmune diseases, and those who are elderly and immobile would probably need a NOAC or low molecular weight for 7 to 28 days. And that's the only guidelines we have. Having said that, if the person has been given low molecular weight for 1 month course in the hospital, I personally would only continue it for 7 more days.
So it's an eye opener in a sense, because there are controversies. We are actually discussing controversies and gray areas, but we are trying to simplify it based on a customized approach. Guidelines are supposed to guide, and we need to modulate them according to the need and the resources which are available in the best of the patient care. So with all this, I think each one would be more enlightened in which patients to use, in which patients not to use, and especially those whom we are discharging them. At least in that, there is a definite clarity. Maybe at home, mild to moderate, whether to start, when to start, how to start, maybe a little of a gray area. But we are certain that when we are discharging them, we know whom to start. If we have a 36-year-old man who's come with a COVID pneumonia, is recovered and he's going home, no need to start him or keep him on Ecosprin or NOACs for 4 weeks. So we have now the guidelines: diabetics, obese, high-risk cases, kidney disease patients, who are bedridden patients, malignancy, as you said. So I think there are clear-cut understanding of the use of this. Coming to one more point, we have already reached 11 and we have crossed more than 800 people who have logged in. But now we have been talking of low platelets and fever. Are we some way, not really looking into our regular causes of fever with thrombocytopenia and carried away by COVID and COVID and COVID? So please just tell a few points each one so that our listeners can take advantage of that.
So based on the last year's experience, listeners in Mumbai, month of May begins and our malaria begins. So please do not ignore patients, even if they are testing positive for COVID, because that is a recommendation that we have to test number of people. Do not miss out on malaria and dengue diagnosis by doing your platelet count and asking for malaria antigen or peripheral smear for malaria and NS1 antigen. Also, do not miss out on enteric fever as one of the causes of non-remitting fever, despite of patient testing COVID positive. So WBC count with little high lymphocyte predominance. Please, whenever possible, palpate the spleen. And do not miss out on these common reasons for fever with thrombocytopenia.
Definitely agree with you, sir. When UTI and other things.
I totally agree with the panel. Malaria, dengue, typhoid, we've seen a lot along with COVID. We've even seen leptospirosis in the last year. And all of these may cause leukopenia or lymphocytosis, but they will probably cause low platelets. I only need to add one line here. In the era where we are talking about vaccination, and the question of low platelets and thrombosis, I would need to add that if anybody after a vaccine dose, maybe the first or second, comes to you with thrombotic episodes or suspected thrombosis within 2 days to about 28 days, please first look at the platelets, as Salil asked, what about the low platelets? So if the platelets are less than 1.5 lakhs, then there is a possibility of VITT, which is vaccine-induced immune thrombocytopenic thrombosis. And in this is very similar to the HIT syndrome. And if you have facilities, you can actually do the platelet factor for antibodies. If not, then here you definitely do the D-dimer. And if the D-dimer is more than 4 times, it is kind of confirming the diagnosis of vaccine-induced thrombosis with thrombocytopenia. So I think that is something we need to look at in the next few months.
It's a fantastic input. Fantastic input.
See, we have tried to, discuss a lot of aspects, the difficult aspects perhaps, and not so much, put across in a lot of webinars. Now I have got a rapid fire because I have got 800 people and logged in, and then I have got a mobile which has got questions. I'll just take 4 or 5 rapid short questions so that we can wind it up with a take home message. And let's be very specific. So, is there a role of oral steroids in mild cases? I will ask Dr. Kinjal. Just give a 1 or 2 line answer because
No, sir, not at all. Not at all.
not at all. Perfect.
That's great. Perfect answer.
Super.
It does more harm.
Yeah, it makes more. That's a take home message.
More mortality in the early case, early introduction of steroids.
Increases the viremia and it can cause more harm as per the recovery study, as Kinjal said.
Perfect. Now coming to Samir, again, offshoot of that same question asked by another doctor is, okay, we are not giving steroids, but you find that the CRP is increased after 3 days. Will you add steroids that time? Just a point blank question. Nothing else has worsened. Only the CRP has increased.
Monitor saturation.
Yeah. So no steroids based on CRP. That's very important. Now the third question, Kumar, for yourself. This gentleman asked. There's a third doctor who asked.
I'm not supposed to answer question.
No, it's very interesting. See, we started with steroids and CRP, then not to add steroid. Now that doctor is asking, if not steroid, then when will you add steroids based on biomarkers, or should we not consider that only?
So the question, if it is when will you add steroids based on biomarkers, I would not add steroids based on biomarkers. We have to understand that the classification of the disease which has been made and so eloquently made by the task force, we have to keep classifying and reclassifying our disease. If the patient is transgressing from mild to moderate, yes, he deserves the steroids. But I would still try that if it is beyond 5 days, it's probably an ideal time. Less than 5 days, unless I'm convinced that it's a moderate case, I wouldn't start steroids at all. So I would not look at the biomarkers.
And last question before we go on with the take home from all of us, Dr. Khusrav, again, a very significant and a very sensitive question is, can biomarkers be helpful to differentiate between COVID and other viral respiratory infections? I know we have been reiterating that, but that question still remains even at the end of it. So I want you to.
It's a very, very valid question, and I'll take just half a minute more to answer this because it can't be answered as a rapid fire. There are initial studies said that you can have co-infection along with COVID. And the co-infection, if it is a viral co-infection like other coronaviruses, we know that there are 6 coronaviruses or influenza or anything else, or enterovirus or whatever it may be, then the biomarkers don't help. But the only biomarker which here I would use in a hospital setting is a procalcitonin. And procalcitonin is the only biomarker which does not go up in COVID pneumonia. Only and only when it has a secondary bacterial infection or a fungal infection, the procalcitonin may go up. So if initially it was negative and now patient has got better and again getting worse, I would probably think of a secondary bacterial infection because we've used steroids, we may have used Ocili, and therefore bacterial and fungal can be very high. And here I might do a PCT, but I would not depend upon any other co-infections where whether they are viral, the treatment remains the same.
Superb. So I think that summarizes about the procalcitonin, which we had not touched upon because we were dealing only with COVID, but it's a very important marker for bacterial infections and sepsis. So that's it. I think now I would from my side thank all of you for being here today and discussing. But the last take-home messages from each one of you, starting from Kinjal, then Samir, then Dr. Kumar, then Dr. Khusrav, and then I will just wind up everything. So please, Dr. Kinjal.
Thank you, sir, for giving me the opportunity, sir. I would like to end my talk and as a panelist with my teaching from my teacher, Dr. J.M. Joshi. Treat the patient and its clinical features. Don't base your treatment on biomarkers and the lab investigations.
Dr. Samir.
So don't base your clinical decisions based on trends in IL-6 or D-dimer. Take your history properly and see your patient clinically. Your discharges cannot be based on D-dimer. If your patient came with 91% and is now 97%, irrespective of his D-dimer and other biomarkers, patient is ready to go home.
So, Dr. Kumar, before you, we are moderators, so we'll take it at the last. So, I would like Dr. Khusrao to please give his take-home message.
So basically, I always like to quote Einstein, who said that all that counts cannot be counted, and what can be counted does not count. So I have no time to explain all this, but please treat the patient and not the number. And biomarkers, whether it be POCUS, whether it be HRCT, are all tools, and it is not the tools that matter, it is the person behind the tools that matters. And I think we need to understand that if we use them appropriately, we can do good for patient care. And we are in a very, very bad pandemic, the second, third wave across the country. And I wish everyone here and all our fellow colleagues to be safe and tide over this crisis as well.
So, Kumar, please, your closing remarks.
Closing remark is very simple. All my biomarkers are only going to help me validate my clinical decision. Clinically, if I feel it's mild, I don't ask for a report. If I feel that clinically it's getting moderate, then I need some validation from the biomarkers to get up. Unless I'm going to get an actionable information from the test, there is no point in doing the test. I can just take half a minute more and tell you a recent case where a patient had a vehicular accident. He went for a CT thorax and it was reported as CORAD 5 and the CT score was given as 10. Thereby got admitted at SRV hospital in Chembur. I saw him clinically. I could not find any iota of COVID anywhere. Rapid antigen negative, RT-PCR negative. But the D-dimer were 3000, but that was because of his trauma. So neither the GP wanted the patient to be discharged, neither the patient wanted discharge, neither the relatives wanted a discharge. Repeat RT-PCR comes negative. Then I get a CT reported and I tell the radiologist, boss, he has a breathing artifact because of thoracic pain. He has 4 rib fractures. And then he reports the CT score of 0. And only when the CT score of 0 was reported, he was eventually discharged as a non-COVID patient. So these things are happening day in and day out. So we guys have to be careful. As Dr. Khusrao said, don't count everything that is countable, and everything that is countable just never counts. So I would just quote him.
Very nice case. I am taking just 10 seconds. So this patient had a flail chest with contused lung. Yes. Pulmonary edema, contused lungs are the non-COVID findings, but you need a proper radiologist to actually give that. And this patient clearly had contused lung, because of which his D-dimer and everything else was high, and the HRCT was given a CORADS of 4. So very nice case to discuss.
CORADS 5, score CT severity score 10.
Was it at 2 in the night?
It was fortunately at 4 p.m. in the evening. So
even worse. Yeah.
So just to put things in perspective, when we talked about the biomarkers in COVID and home management, please avoid using Ecosprin for homebound patients, even if they are mild. There is no need and no indication, no data to suggest that we should be using Ecosprin. Secondly, biomarkers will definitely help you assess the prognosis, but again, the treatment parameters, your basic line of treatment would not change. So don't repeat them again and again, and don't base your decisions about oxygen, admission, remdesivir based on increased CRP. Go clinically. I think that every of us doctors who are trained, all of us doctors do that, but there is such a load and such a patient-centric force that we definitely need to think about everything in the given situation. But take-home message is that. Third is, if the patient is getting admitted, yes, there is a role of enoxaparin, as Dr. Khusrao has mentioned, in cases where we give them and then monitor them, because there would be a risk of bleeding in the high-risk cases also. We need to keep a watch on the platelets. We need to keep a watch on the drop in the hemoglobin in these patients. But when they are being discharged, there's a very important take-home message that please need not keep them on NOACs just because they have been in the hospital for a moderate to severe COVID. It is not that way. So high-risk cases at a risk of developing a thrombus or embolism, we need to continue that in a selected group of patients, which would be perhaps 5% of the number of patients which we are discharging. So that is the third take-home message. And last is IL-6 is an important parameter. It does tell us about the impending cytokine storm, but it has to be again interpreted with its pros and cons, because there are non-COVID causes of IL-6, there are improper collection of blood which can give an abnormal IL-6, and we have a clinical scenario in which we need to apply the IL-6. So we have tried to cover all these aspects and also told you a little bit about procalcitonin, and not to forget pro-BNP. Though we have not spoken about that, but please remember, a patient with fluid overload, presenting with breathlessness, elderly person, take help of a pro-BNP, because many places 2D echo is still not being done in the COVID areas, in the COVID wards. Or so take help of these markers. They may actually guide you whether we should diurize this patient, should we reduce their steroids, because some of them patient may be actually on high dose steroids, which may push them into further fluid retention. So try to think of biomarkers in that aspect also, need not be only in a line of a COVID case. So with that, I thank all the panelists, and though Dr. Guleria is not right now with us, but I will definitely thank him on a personal note for taking time for us. Last announcement, next Sunday, we are going to have a discussion on controversies in the management or treatment, pharmacology, pharmacotherapeutics of COVID. And I'm sure many of us would be eager, and even I am excited to be a part of that discussion. Thank you, Zydus, for being a strong technical support throughout our web series on COVID, and Kumar for all your support and all your co-moderation with me. So thank you and have a great Sunday.
Thank you, Kumar and Salil, for moderating this session so wonderfully and summarizing each and everything. Hats off to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Kumar sir and Salil sir, and thank you, Kushru
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
for
Kushra,
inviting
for
me.
coming.
Yes, sir, was amazing.
Thank you.
We'll keep inviting you. Don't worry. Don't worry. Okay. Bye-bye. See you. Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye.